Hi, my name is Lindy Jung. I am a science fiction and fantasy writer, and I talk about writing and books on this channel, and today we're back with another writing advice or tips video. Today we're actually going to talk about the bane of many a writer's existence, and that is story pacing. Whether your pacing is too fast or too slow, there's all sorts of issues you can run into with this, and pacing really affects reader experience especially. Generally speaking, you want a story that can carry you along, but still has sufficient breaks to allow the reader to really absorb what is going on and to allow the characters moments of development and growth and introspection. In my opinion, every story has slightly different pacing needs, and unfortunately I cannot address all of them in this little video with 8 tips, but I'm just going to share some generalized tips for you guys that have actually helped me address various pacing issues in the past, and I hope they'll be helpful to you too. But of course, like always, prescriptivist writing advice is for the birds. We don't do that here. If these tips don't work for you, that is totally fine. But yeah, let's go ahead and dive right into it. So tip number 1, I don't know why I did 6. Tip number 1, figure out the beginning and end of each scene before you actually sit down and write it. This is really helpful for me because it makes sure that I'm working towards something, so figuring out the ending of the scene is actually a little bit more important than figuring out the beginning, but it's nice to have the bookmarks. But for me, if I don't really have a clear idea of what I'm working toward in a scene, I end up rambling, I get lost in the weeds, and the pacing of the scene slackens a lot as a result. And this is a problem for me even though I'm someone who usually outlines, because my outlines tend to kind of look at the bigger picture. I'm either outlining on the chapter level or act by act, and not necessarily looking at each scene individually until I sit down to write it. So it's been really helpful for me to take a moment to figure out how those scenes will play out, even if it means just sort of taking a couple minutes before I start writing it. And if you're someone who would rather discovery write your scenes and sort of ramble around until you figure out that perfect ending, then I highly recommend revising with this technique in mind and basically going, okay, does this service the ending? How can I make the scene more compact? How can I make sure that it's very focused toward that endpoint of the scene? Tip number 2 is to determine the logical consequences of each choice your characters make. The 3 C's, which I've made a video about and I'll link that below, is a storytelling fundamental that has helped me upgrade my writing. Basically, the 3 C's are context, choice, and consequence. So you have the scenario that each scene starts with, you have the choice that the character makes, and then you have the consequences of that choice. And what this does is creates a very logical chain of events. And if readers can sort of anticipate that consequence based on that choice, they're going to be more inclined to keep reading and figure out what happens. I just find that writing with the 3 C's in mind helps give my stories a really compelling and coherent flow. And this in turn just really helps out pacing. It makes your work very readable, and it makes the pacing a little tighter as well. Tip number 3 is more of a revising tip, but this is to actually look out for scenes where your characters are only talking. If it's a dialogue only scene, they're not doing much else, it's only a conversation, depending on the vibe that your story has, depending on what genre you're writing in, too many of these might not be a good thing for your pacing. It might slow your pacing down quite a bit. If you stumble upon a scene like this in your draft, then an easy fix is to just give the characters something to do, or amp up the tension, or make it so that there's higher stakes to that conversation. Nowadays, there's a lot of emphasis on banter in writing, and I don't think there's anything wrong with banter. I really enjoy it, but especially in genre fiction, if it's just a banter scene and nothing else is going on, that's going to slow down your pacing, that's going to make the story sort of lose that momentum. And you don't always have to shoehorn in like an action scene or a chase scene. Sometimes it is better and more necessary to focus on the characters and the dialogue and the emotions of the moment. So you could always take a look at that dialogue scene and figure out what emotions are happening here. Where's the underlying tension coming from? What are the stakes of this conversation? Just make sure that something is being pushed forward in that dialogue scene, even if it's just a character arc or 2. But generally speaking, plain dialogue scenes, especially too many of them, are not going to be super compelling to read. I find this is especially true in the early stages of a book, like the first act, before you've kind of built up goodwill and trust with the reader. Personally, for me, reading a bunch of dialogue scenes in a row, especially ones where things are being told to me through dialogue, I find that really frustrating. I find that it slows down the pace quite a bit as well. Tip number 4 is to study a plot beat template or formula like Save the Cat or something else, and figure out what beats you need to hit in your story and when. So pacing isn't just scene by scene or chapter by chapter, it also occurs on that macro level. I don't follow Save the Cat religiously, but generally speaking, I do expect a midpoint twist or a midpoint peak, like something should happen in the middle of the book that shakes things up a little bit. And without that, I kind of feel like the plot turns into a straight wobbly line. So even if you're not a believer in templates and plot formulas, which at a certain point I think that most writers should graduate from those and just kind of follow their instincts when it comes to story beats, if you're having trouble with that macro level pacing, if you're having trouble figuring out where the next tension beat is going to come from, something like that is usually helpful to just refer back to kind of figure out your footing, get a sense of what you need. Tip number 5 is a line level pacing hack. It's to cut unnecessary words. Pacing is so finicky that it's even affected by your word choice, your sentence choice, the flow of your sentences and your dialogue and everything. So tight line writing is also actually going to influence and improve your pacing. Some words that I tend to look out for when I'm cutting are unnecessary filter words. For example, she saw the birds flying overhead versus the birds flew overhead. She saw is the filter word here. You don't really need to filter that stimuli through the point of view of the narrator. Another thing to look out for is the unnecessary usage of imperfective aspects. Okay, so as it turns out, I had this wrong. Imperfective aspects are actually a broader concept that kind of has more to do with time, and what I'm really talking about here is the usage of auxiliary verbs. So from here on out, I am talking about auxiliary verbs. Sorry about the misunderstanding. Which I absolutely, I had to look this up. I had no idea there was an official term for this. In grammatical terms, this is basically when you put a to be verb in front of another verb. So something like it is raining versus it rains. It is raining is using an imperfective aspect. A lot of people tend to do this with character action. For example, she is running or she is smiling instead of she runs or she smiles. And finally, the big one for me, and this one is a little bit more vague, but this is a personal issue I have, and it's repetitive flowery descriptions that all mean the same thing. So in my early drafts especially, I really tend to kind of throw around a few different metaphorical phrases or pieces of imagery to kind of figure out which one fits best, and then I kind of leave them there. So you'll see me writing paragraphs about spring trees blooming, and I'll use 10 different adjectives, 3 different sentences to essentially describe the same thing. You know, in revisions, of course, I don't want that to bog down the pacing of the story or to just be ridiculous and flowery for no reason, so I have to go back and figure out which sentence works the best, which one is the most concise, or which one is the most interesting, and cut everything else. Tip number 6 is to watch out for tracking. I actually plan on making a video about this concept entirely. This is another thing that I haven't really seen a lot of writing channels, writing advice folks talking about, and that I sort of started to notice in my own writing and in the writing of people that I have edited for, and that I've realized actually does weaken writing and weaken pacing. Tracking is when a writer literally tracks a character's every minute movement. Instead of she grabbed the glass, it'll be her fingers twitched, her wrist flicked toward the table, she cast her gaze downward and pursed her lips in consideration, sorry I'm reading, before she grabbed the glass. It's just unnecessary for something so small. Unless there's major significance in the character grabbing the glass, you really don't need to do all that. You can just say she grabbed the glass. This is really noticeable in action and fight scenes for me. You can tell if a writer has really studied something like sword fighting because they will literally describe every tiny movement that the swordsman makes. And sometimes tracking does work in context. For example, again, if there's major significance in the character grabbing the glass, or if the point of view character is a detective and is watching the suspect's movements very, very closely and is trying to get a read of what they're actually thinking and feeling. But generally speaking, if you are tracking a smaller action like this, it's going to slow down the whole scene, so keep an eye out for tracking. Alright, tip number 7 is watch out for and cut filler dialogue. I am very bad about this because I tend to hear dialogue in my head and I just sort of write it verbatim. There's a lot of weird little noises that people are making in my dialogue. I don't need all that, no one needs all that. And my dialogue also tends to read in a really roundabout way. Just trim your dialogue down, make it get to the point. It does not need to read the way actual people speak, it just has to convey what you need to convey. So I guess generally speaking, just look out for super long dialogue portions and try to cut what you can, because again, it does affect the pacing. And tip number 8 is to ask for an outside opinion. If you're really having trouble identifying where exactly your pacing is too slow or too fast, you can always find beta readers, critique partners, or professional editors. I know this can be scary, especially for newer writers, but really there's no better way to improve than to find someone who has really good insights and opinions and get them to look at your work and have them tell you what you're doing right and what you could improve on, that sort of thing. Not to, shamelessly plug myself, but I actually do offer free editorial services on a first come first serve basis once a month over on my Patreon if you want to check out a cost-effective option, I guess. But, and here's the key point here, Before you just throw your manuscript at someone, identify what specific areas you sense or feel like you have trouble with, and then come up with specific guiding questions for the people reading your work. So instead of just asking like, is the pacing here bad? You want to ask something more specific. For example, where did your attention begin to wane? Were you able to follow what was happening in this action scene? Where in the book did you feel the most engaged while you were reading? Questions like these are really helpful. What am I saying? If you ask questions like these, even to someone who hasn't done professional editorial work or is just like your coworker or friend or family member who kind of reads for fun, they should be able to answer really specifically and accurately regardless, because it's very much based off their reading experience versus any insights into writing craft that they may or may not lack. And it's going to help you pinpoint exactly what areas need work, because pacing really does boil down to reader experience. And that's it. Those are all the tips for today. Short video. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know if you have your own pacing tips in the comments below. I'll see you next time. Bye.